everyone. My name is Constance Crawford. I teach accounting at Ramapo College of New Jersey. I'm going to share my screen with you if I can. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to take a look at the impact that the CARES Act would have on the economy as far as COVID was concerned. So I teach accounting. I'm also the director of the Master of Science in Accounting program. And essentially what I have seen is that whenever there is a crisis, a health crisis, to the extent that we've seen since March 2020, and in some parts of the world even a bit earlier, is that when there is a medical crisis, the economies throughout all broad spectrums of economic backgrounds, to a certain extent, stop. And we have certain countries like the United States that have ample resources to help their constituents and the people that live there. And then you have other governments and parts of the world that don't have that foundational resources that would perhaps allow them to survive such a long-term crisis. And so I wanted to take a look at the CARES Act, which is the legislation that was put through initially by President Trump. And then once our new President Biden came in, he expanded some of the benefits and continued to provide assistance and aid to all of the different businesses, individuals, etc. And so our economy is a very, very high profile functioning economy. I think worldwide people will follow our stock market as an indication of the strength of our financial ability to continue to operate in the manner in which we have. And when COVID hit, and in essence, our economy shut down, it really was very off-putting for us, because as an extremely developed economic country, no one ever experienced it. Probably the last time there was such a severe impact was going back to 1929, the stock market crash. And then, of course, prior to that, in 1918, we did have the flu, we had the start of World War I, the end of World War I, et cetera. So all of that, but very historical. We have had blips, we have had setbacks, we have had inflation and so forth, but nothing to the extent of what happened during COVID. So the economy, in essence, crashed. And the need for a strong government to come in to, in essence, create survival ability for an economic system like the United States was quite shocking to everyone. And so that's exactly what had to be dealt with. We had certain industries, airline industries, hotel, cruise lines, et cetera, that essentially were thwarted. They couldn't operate at all. Basically, any way to generate revenue or earn your living, if it required a one-on-one connection, meaning you had to go to the place of business, say a restaurant or a gym or whatever, was not available. Retail was also very limited and at times not at all available. And therefore, it was shocking that we were all, staying at home, very fearful, And yet realizing that we had to take that deep breath and say, all right, how are we going to move forward? And it became very, very important. And so what happened was Congress passed the CARES Act. And I give here a little bit of a history as far as by March 2020, that's when it really hit the United States with a resounding impact. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, emergency rooms, our medical care was overwhelmed. Governors and mayors across the US mandated stay-at-home rules. And it didn't only create a health emergency, it also caused an unforeseen economic crisis. So we were really dealing with it on both levels. A new norm was created. I was just listening to the previous presentation, and the presenter discussed the impact of remote learning, online learning. That is something that we are still dealing with in this country. Face masks, social distancing, a fear that the virus would alter our lives forever. People were hoarding certain types of products, so it was hard to get paper products or cleaning products. And it became very problematic for the most vulnerable in our society. Those that perhaps depended on that weekly salary or paycheck that no longer had access to that. If, say, they were working in a restaurant or doing a job that stopped, they didn't earn their salary, how were they going to live? Travel, clearly, anything to do with entertainment stopped. And as the US struggled with this pandemic, certain trends emerged. And in our country, we saw a tremendous amount of collapse of some iconic retail giants. We saw J.C. Penney close. We saw Lord and Taylor's close. We saw Brooks Brothers close. We saw an unbelievable amount of layoffs of workers, closing of major corporations that had quite a large footprint in our economic base. The oil and gas industry, and it's so interesting because in such a truncated period of time, as a professor, this is, living in interesting times. You can really bring the world into your classroom. Initially, oil and gas prices were collapsing. The cost of the barrel of oil just sinking lower and lower and lower. Why? There was no demand, there was fear, there was all kind of crisis. Fast forward a year and a half later, the cost of gas is through the roof. And amazing that it didn't take months and months and years in some industries for there to be that sharp upswing. And there are other aspects to the cause of oil and gas prices going up. Airlines hobbled. I think we're probably facing some pending airline bankruptcies, although just this week, we are starting to ease restrictions on international travel. Perhaps that will help that. Stock market, boom. Whenever there's any bad news, whenever there is any risk, whenever there's elements of something you didn't plan for, and you have no idea of what the outcome will be, the market reacts very negatively. And again, the market started to crumble. So how was our government going to, in a very truncated short period of time, kind of slow down the reaction so that people had time to kind of step back, take a breath, realize that we can be a little bit more thinking out of the box and innovative, and hopefully find a resolution that will not harm our society dramatically. And so the answer was the CARES Act. CARES Act stood for the Corona Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. It went in place March 27th, 2020. And on March 18th, President Trump signed into law the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which included emergency paid sick leave, emergency family and medical leave, etc. And what was the intent? It was the intent to alleviate the strain of unemployment for US workers and provide much needed support for fledgling industries. CARES Act had the following reliefs, many of them tax. My interest is very much in tax, on trying to help the crippling economic crisis. So what happened was, we have in place in our country a progressive tax which is aimed at, in essence, targeting the members of our society, whether business or individual, that generate the highest amount of taxable income should therefore pay the highest amount of tax. Prior to COVID, President Trump really did alter the landscape of tax. He lowered corporate tax rates significantly, and he also eliminated certain perks in response to the fact that corporations' tax rates fell down from a high of 35% to now 21%. That's a 14% bump up to your bottom line. With that, President Trump took away the ability, if a company had previous losses, to shelter taxes going forward in the future. Once COVID hit, once there was an acknowledgement that, hey, we're going to have a lot of corporations that are going to be generating tremendous amounts of losses. And if they had in the past paid taxes during their more profitable days, we were now going to allow them to kind of claw back or take, if you will, a refund for prior taxes paid pre-pandemic. So it's kind of a business welfare help, but it also was better than, in essence, just handing out money. It was almost, will allow you to recoup monies that an individual business had paid in prior, more profitable time periods. So it's almost like a psychological tweak. I mean, essentially, you've got one bucket of money, and you can find ways to distribute that money so that society benefits. The federal government could have just said, all right, any corporation suffering a loss, we're going to give you a certain amount. But I think this was probably a more creative and a more positive way of doing it, because it was, in essence, giving back what had already been paid in. So that was very, very important. Payroll and employment tax in our country, both the employer and the employee has to set aside monies for both healthcare for the elderly and the disabled and retirement. We essentially said, don't worry, businesses do not have to make those payments now, because an acknowledgement of financial crisis, an acknowledgement of cash flow issues, you don't want to put an additional burden on employers. We also gave incentives for any employer who kept their employees during the pandemic. Instead of laying them off, they gave them a credit, or they could get $10,000 from the federal government for every employee that they kept on their payroll. And essentially what that did is it really underwrote and at times even paid for that employee's salary. Again, from a psychological perspective, these employees would have had to have been paid something, unemployment, which would have come out of the coffers of the government as well. Again, a more positive, proactive, psychologically forward-thinking concept is, instead of paying it out as unemployment, let's provide an incentive for employee retention. There was things like depreciation. We allowed any company that went out and made a major purchase that they could deduct the full amount of the purchase during that tax year. What does that do? It provides an incentive if a company has the wherewithal to buy something, and that beneficial tax saving, which is always in our country, especially a big driver. And we also upped the ability for corporations and individuals to make more contributions to the charities. When President Biden came in, essentially, 8 or 9 months into the full pandemic, additional payments and additional incentives were made. We were paying unemployment plus additional monies, which would underwrite the cost of certain industries and employees that could not work. There was a restriction on evictions. You could not evict either a storefront, commercial property, residence for non-payment of rent. Banks were not foreclosing on loans and mortgages and debt that was not being paid for. So it became just a very good supportive system that did provide the relaxed mindset. The economy stopped faltering. The stock market has recovered and then some. Right now, we're breaking all kinds of records on profitability and value, et cetera. And clearly, once the ability to have our inoculations, the vaccines, it did open up our society more, and there was somewhat of a return to normalcy, although we're not there at all. Whether or not this is the answer does remain a bit of a question. Right now, we are struggling with supply chain issues. We're struggling with inability for a lot of small business owners to find employees who want to work. So we're kind of struggling with, are we helping too much? Are we disincentivizing people going back into the workforce? That's an issue. We also have to look at the problem that would occur because you have so many small businesses that maybe haven't been able to collect a rent on properties. So it is spreading across our country. We are coping. Hopefully we will all learn from one another. Hopefully through our world economic conferences like this, we'll find, aspects of what was successful in one venue versus another. But the United States clearly was at an advantage because from an economic perspective, we had a very, very strong beginning. So we weren't starting from a point of weakness. Our standard of living, the availability of healthcare, all was in place. And so even though we struggled, even though it did put a crisis on healthcare and so forth, we had the bare bones to begin with. And I think, we learned from that. I think our members of our country now acknowledge how important it is to have the availability of healthcare, the availability of a government willing to assist, and perhaps become more involved in the world stage as far as helping members of other communities. So that's my presentation. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.